Good afternoon. Today I'd like to give you an update on a few of the issues the energy industry is facing. The first issue I'd like to talk to you about is oil prices. They've been too low for producers for quite a long time, back since at least 2012. If we look at the chart I have shown here, there was a peak in prices way back in 2008, and then they dropped straight down during the Great Recession. And at that point, the United States began a process they called quantitative easing, basically to try to get interest rates down, get more debt into the economy, and they were able to counteract the debt bubble that had been popped back in 2008, and that kind of pumped prices back up again. And so the prices went back most of the way to the 2008 peak. But if we go back to about 2012, that's about the time that oil companies started saying these prices are way too low. Actually, they started a little after that, but they looked back at the 2012 and they said we just weren't making enough. We didn't have enough to pay all of the things we expected to pay, including dividends to our shareholders, to invest in new wells, to pay all the taxes. It just wasn't working out. So when they started complaining, if we look at it in today's prices, it was about $120 per barrel, oil was. If we look recently, it's been down around $40 per barrel. I believe it's a little below that now. And it dropped as low as $20 per barrel. And so you can see 120 versus 40 is 3 times as high versus 20 is 6 times as high. So we're talking about a huge, huge difference in price relative to what the producers want. If we look at OPEC, we know OPEC is the one that supposedly has the low cost of production. But what happens with OPEC is that they need very high tax revenue to support their whole economies because they need to pay food subsidies to the many poor people in their countries. They need to develop jobs programs. Oil is the biggest part of their whole economy. It's not like they have some other part of the source of income. In fact, the oil production may head into terminal decline if oil prices cannot be raised to the $100 plus level. And we just said 120, but it's got to be way up there. If we look at what's happened, if you look at this chart, oil production, apart from the United States and Canada, which is that top green segment, has been flat since about 2005. And it's only the United States and Canada that were able to develop some of their more expensive to extract resources to try to get more oil out. And now it's that more expensive to extract oil that's especially being threatened. With these higher costs of production, they need to higher prices. As we just said, OPEC needs the higher prices, but so do the US and Canada. In fact, even those rest of the world producers on that last slide need higher prices to offset depletion. If we look at the drilling rigs which these oil producers use, we find that the drilling rig count is down dramatically. It fell first in 2014, but now most recently with the pandemic, it's way, way down in 2020. The third issue I'd like to point out is that the low price problem comes from consumers being unable to purchase the economic output. This is kind of a strange thing to talk about. We can think about the economy as being a self-organizing system. a system that has businesses and it has consumers, it has governments and taxes, and what happens is that they all support each other, and the people who are the workers are especially important because they're the consumers. And if these workers are not getting high enough wages, they can't really afford to buy the output of the economy. This is not a connection we stop to think about, but it's especially the low-paid workers that are the problem. And what happens, the problem is that these low-wage workers, there's both high-wage and low-wage workers. And when you have an economy that has a lot of specialization, what happens is you have many high-wage workers that have had a great deal of advanced training. They may also have some supervisory responsibility, and they end up taking most of the funds that are available for wages, leaving relatively little for the low-paid workers that are doing some of the more ordinary tasks. And what we also find is that if we have globalization, as we do now, the people in India, for example, can't afford to buy new cars. They can't afford to buy the same kind of houses that we buy now. And so it's their low wages that contributes to the fact that there's not enough buying power in the world. Loans aren't as helpful to low-wage workers because they very often are getting their debt through credit cards, and they may be paying over 20% interest rate on these credit card debts. It's not like they're getting the very low interest rates that some of the speculators are getting. Robots sometimes replace workers completely, leaving these workers without jobs, and of course robots can't actually buy the output of the economy. And now, as we have these shutdowns due to COVID, the problem becomes much worse. We have many more who are unemployed. The rich find they no longer can purchase overseas vacations. They need fewer fancy clothes. What happens is it's sort of like taking sticks out from the dome that I just showed you of the whole economy. It tends to pull out parts of the economy that are essential, even though they don't look essential. It's the fact that these people in poor countries, for example, no longer have jobs making these new clothes that the people in the rich countries have. The low wage problem is in some ways similar to what happened in the 1920s. In fact, it also even happened back as far as at the time of World War I. It's really a wage disparity problem, and it's the top 1% that's getting way too much of the total, and the bottom is getting very little. And what happens, though, when you have this big wage disparity problem, it's indicative of an underlying problem. And what we saw back then is we went through years in which of depression, we had a couple of world wars, we had a pandemic. There are all kinds of things that go wrong. Eventually it works out, but after much pain. And we're likely to see the oil production drop just because the oil-producing countries can no longer really afford to do what they've done before. The issue number 4 is that we seem to be reaching peak coal as well. And what happens is that coal has relatively low prices too. Recently, these only go through 2019, but you can see how they're way below what they were in 2018 and about 2011. If we actually look at a graph of the world coal production, we find that the coal production is practically flat in recent years. It's been flat since about 2012. And in fact, China is the largest producer in the world, of near half of the total production, and its production is about flat since about 2012. So there is a real problem with the coal production, as well as a potential problem with the oil production with these low prices. If we look at a chart on this next slide, the issue that I see is that oil and coal are the two top energy sources. And you can see them with the red and the blue lines at the top. If we don't have oil and coal, we have a very big problem, because hydro, nuclear, and what I would call other renewables are very small in comparison, and the only one that's pretty big is natural gas. Issue number 5 I'd like to talk about is how difficult it is to depend on natural gas instead. Its prices have been low in recent years too. In fact, 2020, which is not shown on this chart, is lower yet. If you look at the chart below, you see that Japan liquefied natural gas, LNG, is at 10 in 2019, where recent data says it's down at 4. Now, the producers who are going to the expense of shipping gas as far as Japan have to pay a very high price. So they cannot possibly make money at $4 if that's what the price that's being charged is. Issue 6. The economy needs a bailout similar to the growth of oil production after World War II. Oil played a very important role in bringing the economy out of the slump and the wars that it was in during the period between the 1913 and 1945. Oil was extremely inexpensive to produce, but it was very high valued to the customers, and so it was possible to sell the oil for much higher price than what it cost to produce it. With this high sales price relative to the cost of producing it, it had a very high, what they sometimes call energy return on energy investment. But they could sell it for many times, maybe 50 times or at least 20 times as much as it cost to produce. It was basically the opposite of needing a subsidy, and the fact that there was so much oil that was produced, it was added to what the other was available. It helped the economy in many different ways. The high taxes helped the government, because that way they could build things like roads and the electricity transmission lines. It added new jobs. The dividends that they paid to the shareholders, they helped the pension funds, so the whole economy benefited. Without a new, exceedingly inexpensive to produce energy source, a concern we have is that the economy will tend to shrink back and may even collapse. The conclusion I reach is that the world economy really needs a new, very inexpensive energy source now. The current economic situation makes it difficult to reach this goal. The economy is doing poorly. The overall energy return of today's fuel mix seems to be too low. It makes it difficult to fund the temporary subsidies that any new alternative might be able to use. This economic crisis that we are in the midst of may take years to resolve, and energy innovations probably won't work right now in this part of the cycle, but they may have a chance in the rebuilding stage. There may be a ray of hope. I saw a recent headline that said United Arab Emirates bets big on space tech to diversify from oil. Even if oil and the other fossil fuels are doing poorly, everybody looks to see if they can find a solution, and they look to space as being one of those possible solutions. So funds may be available for research, even if not for full implementation.